No.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, now it is.
So the first question is going to go to Paul Gordon. Paul Gordon. It's clear that there's been a significant decline in the congregational membership of the churches in the convocation in recent years. Do you think that the decline can continue, and what would you do as a way to address the problem?
Well, am I on? Yeah. When you talk about, can I stand? Is that okay? Yes?
Of course.
When you said, do I think will it continue? We don't continue. Oh, I'm sorry. I can go back and sit down.
I can do this.
It's better.
Go.
Sorry. Here. Give me this. I'll put it back. Well, obviously, that's a big question because every context is different, right? And the dynamics and even the demographics of an area are different from time depending on change and all of that. I do think I love exploring creative ways to connect and communicate to those who traditionally might not connect with the church. I'll give you an example. In Cairo, we had the traditional service. Well, nothing in our churches are too traditional, or in some ways, but it looked traditional. And then we started an alternative service that was very much focused on, really it was more contemplative. It was focused on spirituality as opposed to religion. It's less creedal in emphasis, and it was much broader. And that service in itself, it was candlelight, it was sensory, it was all of that. It took over almost our church and attracted many young people. And many people that would never, ever go to church, both from a Western context or from an Arab context. So we had Muslims coming as well. And why? It touched on something, that deeper level that they had perhaps not yet experienced in their own context. And so that was a surprise. It wasn't a church growth strategy. It was just something that we tried and really we found greatly beneficial to the community. So I think looking at it context by context is critically important, but I think one cannot start by thinking same old, same old. Even if the church is thriving right now, you got to keep thinking creatively because things will change. And so there's that sense of listening and learning and assessing. And what was it, Bart? He always said, even for his sermons, he used two things. He used the Bible and the New York Times or a newspaper or something like that. I think in a symbolic way, I think that is critical. One other thing I want to say is that I think it's very important that we get outside the church walls and that we create, whether it be programs or events or initiatives that associate the church not just with the religious. And so our church, we took even the pews out and we make it an art gallery. And we had thousands of people come. We'd bring Omar Sharif to come and speak, and the Grand Mufti, and movie stars, and writers. And so you had people in Cairo, for example, thousands of people who would say, oh, my church is St. John's. But they never came to the service, per se. But they did fund it because they were transformed by some of the programs as a result.
Thank you. I just want, in case you were having any doubt about it, if you don't want to use the full 4 minutes, you don't have to. That's not required. This question goes to Mark. How do you feel about working in a multinational, multicultural, and multilingual environment?
I am going to stand. That's kind of a slow softball across home plate. I mean, I love the idea. I think probably none of us would be here if we didn't love the idea. But let me say a little bit more about that to get to what I think the question may be asking. I say in my biography, and it is true, I went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. One thing you have to do to receive a degree from the place that is you must perform at a certain level in a foreign language. And I did that, I have a degree. And that was a long time ago. So I have some work to do, I know. on language in order to be effective in doing the work that this role involves. At the same time, I'll say this. I think the condition of learning the language of the culture and communities around us is the condition of every Christian today. So by doing that as the bishop, I want to model how we engage with the communities around us. We are already multi-ethnic in our own pews. We are multilingual in our own pews. That can be the means by which we engage with a community around us, with a city around us that is those things already. We reflect that reality. We in the convocation can offer that model of how to be church. And it will become a model that is increasingly important in the rest of the Episcopal Church. Because I will tell you that my little church in St. John's in Newtonville, most of those folks didn't grow up Episcopal. Many of them come from other cultures because we're a place with a lot of universities. So we are beginning to see the changes happening back in the United States that you are already living here. So how do I feel about it? I feel like I'm living on the cutting edge of the church, coming into a place that's multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural. That's who God calls us to be.
Thanks. This question is to Ben Shambaugh and very specific. You've been away from the cathedral for 25 years. What about being back here, presumably again for this diocese, has surprised you or changed your thinking about being bishop here?
Well, you walk into this place, some people told me that other people in the convocation perceive the cathedral as rich, and there was this idea, it was J.P. Morgan, it was all this stuff, and, I used to go to the Friends of the Cathedral cocktail parties in Washington, D.C. when I lived down there, and it really was the old guard, right? And they said you missed the glory days, which was about 1949, right after the war. Americans were king, and this place was amazing. It's changed. I think the thing that is wonderful is not just the cathedral, but the convocation. The conversations that is not just for people who are working abroad for a company or a student or just happen to summer here or something like that, but the sense of mission, of truly reaching local languages. When I was here, we didn't do anything in French, except we had an old Catholic priest who helped us with the French service. The dean who I worked with didn't speak any French because they said you didn't need to. Mission has changed, and the excitement of mission has changed. And I think it's wonderful to be back here, but the world is just a very different place, and I think needs the church more than ever. I said this a little bit in my video. I think we're in a place right now where people are just divided. And when I was here before, people were proud to be Americans. We had an American flag out front. Now I think, we don't talk about that so much. And we want to talk about our faith and how our faith is lived and who we are. And actually want to say to people, that's not who I am, this is who I am, right? This is what I believe, and this is how I live it out. And I see that happening here in Paris and in all the different places of the convocation. So I think it's an exciting place to be. I'm a different person than I was 25 years ago, but so is the convocation, so is the cathedral, so is Europe. But that's an exciting thing. And so I really don't want to come in saying I know everything here, because I don't. And my languages used to be pretty good too, and I need to ramp them up. But we can do that together, and I think that's a great thing.
Thanks so much. This question from a parishioner from Emmanuel Church, Geneva, for Steve. In light of your skill, talents, track record, what do you see your contribution to the life and ministries of parishes as being, should you become a division?
That is a very soft ball. Thank you for that one. I think that each of us brings his own unique gifts. That's one of the amazing things about participating in this process. And I have to thank the convocation once again for making this process so welcoming and open. And I know that my prayer is the same as my brothers here, that the Holy Spirit will guide you to select the bishop who will lead the ministry of the Episcopal Church in Europe into an exciting new phase. And I've approached this process in the spirit of discernment since the beginning of it. I have to say I have learned so much about myself in the process of it. I've learned so much about my church, and my sense of wonder and awe at the gift that we have of this church has just deepened so much as a result of this process. As far as who I am in particular, I am a citizen both of the United States and the European Union. My father was actually born in a displaced persons camp in the American sector of Germany in 1945 because my family fled Lithuania in 1944 during the Second World War. And like so many families from the Baltic states, we were homeless and had no place to be. Now, for me, as I was born in the US, this is a source of great pride, and I have the luxury of being able to say that. For my relatives who actually lived through it, they didn't have that luxury, and it was a source of shame and sadness. One of the things that motivated me to participate in this process was knowing firsthand the pain of being from a refugee family and the profoundly spiritual experience it is to be cast out of your home and never be able to return, because none of my grandparents never returned, and only one of my aunts was able to go back to Lithuania at one point when I was living there. I lived there for 4 years in total and worked as a journalist. This kind of bicultural background of mine, being an American who has European roots that are all scrambled up, has been profoundly informative to who I am as a cleric in the church. It means that, like so many priests, I am of my congregation and yet not of my congregation. I stand within it and outside of it, because that's kind of the way that I've gone through life. And it can be a scary thing, but it's also an asset in ministry. It's also what Jesus did. He was of his own people and yet stood outside of them and was able to critique them when they were not doing what he thought they should be doing. So I think that's one of the core things that I bring to it. It's also part of the experience of coming from an immigrant family is that I've never had anything to fall back on myself. So I got to Yale and went there as an undergraduate, not because anyone in my family had ever been there, but because I learned about it and that was something maybe to aspire to. I went to Cambridge for the same reason. I became a journalist, not because I knew anyone who had done it before, but because it seemed interesting and I felt that I was being led to do that. So that's the way I've approached life. And I think it's a pretty spiritually grounded way to approach life, and a good way for a Christian leader to exercise his or her ministry.
Thank you. Next question to Mark Ellington. How do you see the devotion? How do you see the relationship between the Episcopal Church and the Roman Church?
I think we're setting a very good example for them. I want to say the very first day I ever put on a collar, I was a deacon, just ordained the day before in Boston, Massachusetts, and I went on my way to church where I was going to read the gospel for the first time to the Dunkin' Donuts. And I walked in the door, and the lady behind the counter looked at me and immediately was angry. And I realized at that moment that I lived in a place where the Catholic Church is extremely strong in the Archdiocese of Boston. It was just beginning to go through what we all know is this terrible story about the abuse of clerical authority in sexual abuse of children and adults. And that this was saying to that person behind the counter that I was aligned with that institution that had caused this harm. Now, that wasn't a moment in which I could say, actually, there was a Reformation and we are a different church, and that's not, you can't do that. You have to acknowledge the reality of that pain. I will also tell you, though, that in my own path through seminary, it was my great good fortune to take virtually all of my scripture classes at a Jesuit seminary, where I became deeply formed by the ethos of Jesuits who are very engaged with the real issues of the world and living out the gospel on the ground. As Ignatius taught his company, we live with 1 foot off the ground and we are ready to move wherever God calls us in a moment's notice. So I think, there are many aspects of especially social theology that I've been deeply formed by in the Roman tradition. But I'm very clear that we are a distinct church. We live in this place of tension in the middle between Reformed and Rome. We have taken on the rich tradition of the liturgy and the idea of an ordered ministry, but we are a democratically governed church. We are a church where the people, all of you, are in control, run the books, are, what is the phrase from the canons? The vestry is responsible for the prudential affairs of the parish. We share authority in this church. That is the most important distinction, I think, between ourselves and our brothers and sisters in Rome. So I think there are places for us to have useful dialogue. There are places for us to work usefully together. There are services we can offer together, I mean service to others in need. There are ways in which we can be in dialogue together and learn from each other's traditions. But ultimately, what makes us a distinctive church, offering a different message to people looking for a connection with God and the world, is that we are a church in which authority and responsibility are shared.
Thank you. This one's to Paul Gordon. You have been elected bishop, and somewhere down the line, you understand that one of the clergy members in your care has abused children. What do you do?
Who asked that question? Great. Well, I mean, obviously, there's the general overall issue of when clergy, that's part of pastoral care of clergy, and what they, when they step over the line in various ways, and how does one handle that? And then there's the more specific question related to this issue. I think, obviously, it's an issue that is very warm to people's thoughts and minds right now with all that's going on. As to a crisis with the clergy in general, I would say that one has to approach that delicately. Hopefully there's enough of a relationship between the bishop and the clergy member that one can be honest and open and look at that much more intimately together. I think there's often, and also not shaking unnecessarily the situation in the congregation, in the church. I also think that it's also a time when the bishop can use some outside support and encouragement and advice and counsel, such as the Council of Advice. I've benefited a lot from those, having those around me and getting their insight and wisdom for decisions that perhaps even only I could make, whether they were nay or yay, or that we needed to make together. Obviously, that's not something that you in any way mess around with, and you take action quickly, but I think it's critically that it's done in the ways that don't unnecessarily create further harm to the local congregation and the church at large.
Thank you. Ben, What's your view on the work that's being done to introduce bias-free and inclusive language in the Book of Common Prayer?
So I have been a General Convention deputy for several General Conventions, and I'm on the committee at General Convention on liturgy and music, which has taken up a lot of the prayer book issues. I was not on the specific committee on prayer book this year, but I'm very intimately involved in some of these discussions. Inclusive language, I was pointing out right outside, there's a memorial here that was put up with the DAR related to the World War II monument outside, and it translates the French humanité to mankind. And that plaque is interesting to me because it will date the time, the era that plaque was put up, because it's not what we would use today, right? The whole idea of putting the prayer book into English in the first place, in our Thomas Cranmer, was to put it in the vernacular, in the language of the people. And I think in Europe particularly, we know that language changes. In fact, one of the biggest things we worked on this summer at General Convention was that the Spanish in the Spanish translation of the prayer book, like the French in the French translation of the prayer book, really isn't as comfortable in a vernacular sense as many would like, as native speakers would like. And most of the work was not French, it was actually Spanish. We worked on a lot of the Spanish translations and tried to put a Virgin of Guadalupe in there and Quinceañera and things like that in the real language of the people. And so some of the gender stuff can be a little bit disconcerting. I mean, like many of you, I have the whole service memorized, write one and all the services are right two. And when you flip it, it gets me out of a prayerful state into kind of a more alert but kind of annoyed state, right? And so I get that. But I also understand that when we're reaching out, as Paul was saying, to people who would feel uncomfortable in church, and we look at our language and it excludes half of the human population, it just isn't worth it to not change it, to hold on what we love. So I think it's a both-and process, but I think we need to remember that language, as in our cultures and everything else, continues to evolve, and the prayer book is going to get there. Now, honestly, because I'm part of this at General Convention, there's not going to be a new prayer book until after I retire. I mean, it's going to take a long, long time. But one of the things we did at General Convention, and it worked really hard on this, was to help it bubble up from the ground up. And it's said before, Europe is one of these places where it's already happening. I mean, some of the work that Pierre and you all have done with language in the liturgies and things is really a model of where I think the church is going to go, and the church, in fact, already is. Denis is sitting out here. You did the translations for the prayer book when it first came out. It laid the foundation. It's used all over the place. I used it in Haiti, and I used it in Africa. I mean, Europe can be that kind of place that allows language to grow. So it's not just changing the hymns to hers, but it's thinking deeper about what it means and how we communicate the gospel and the good news of Jesus Christ in a way that people truly understand and doesn't push them away. So I think it's a very important task. The one thing I would say, we talked about art in churches, we kind of need poets in churches too, so it doesn't trip us up, but it becomes more prayerful, because prayer is really at the heart of who we are, and it says who we are, and it shapes what we are inside.
We have one more question. I thank all of you for your questions, but we want to have, we don't have multiples, a full third multiple of 4, and we're also out of time, so I hope you'll understand. Thank you for your good questions. This question is for you, Steve. Ben and Boss suggested that we're in a post-Christian world. That's a sad idea, but probably true. How did Christianity lose its position in the global marketplace? and is there a way back, or is this a long, slow, irreversible decline?
We're all taking notes.
Yes.
Go, Steve, go.
I appreciated the warm-up question earlier, Charlie, for this one here. Obviously, the religious landscape in Europe is significantly different than what it is in the United States. But as Mark especially was noting, the US is headed to where Europe is today. Honestly, from my own perspective, I think that the main thing that European Christians are living with right now is the lack of moral fortitude and prophetic voice of previous generations in this continent. There was a crisis of faith here that occurred during and after the Second World War when the church did not speak out about the most obvious moral ills occurring here. And it's happening again in the United States right now. It is a profound problem that is going to affect Christians for generations in the US. As Episcopalians, we often find ourselves in this difficult position where perhaps we move through life culturally not having friends and family who are associated with religious institutions, and they may look at us like we have two heads when we say we go to church on Sunday mornings. And on the other side, we may have friends and family who are parts of different Christian traditions that don't even see us as Christians at all. I have both these things in my life. And so we're constantly having to thread this needle, and it's incredibly difficult. This is the challenge of our time as a church, to be able to speak and have a moral voice grounded in the gospel of Jesus Christ that speaks the truth about what is happening in the world today. That voice is not out there, and we need to be it. If we keep looking for it to come from somewhere else, it's not going to happen. So the decisions that we make today, the ways we are able to interpret the gospel in a life-giving way that speaks truth to power, is going to affect what this walkabout is going to look like for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th bishops of the convocation who are elected, and for the Episcopal Church in the United States as a whole. Now, I happen to have a passion for this. I'll tell you, you were talking about, one of the earlier questions was about your obstacles and crises of faith. I did have a very many career as a journalist. We have august journalists in the audience here. I understand that and respect your work. I dipped my toe in it for a couple of years and really enjoyed it. Realized I was called to be a priest and not a journalist, so that's why I'm here today. But I've sought over the last couple of years to overcome this deep fear I have of publishing my own writing for the sake of telling what I see to be the truth. And so I've started experimenting with writing pieces about moral and religious issues, religion and society, for the popular press. And I've had pieces in The Guardian, in the New York Times. 2 weeks ago, I had a piece in The Nation magazine about how one of the lessons we didn't learn from 9/11 was how to love your enemy, and the Christian imperative to follow Jesus' commandment in Matthew chapter 5 to do that. And I've done it, my biggest fear was that it would seem like it was an ego-driven project, but I've honestly done it for this reason that I just stated, which is that I don't see that voice. There's so few of us offering that voice. We've got to band together. We have to work, because there's so few of us, to cry out words of prophecy and truth in this time when they are so sorely needed.
Thank you so much, and thank all of you. I mentioned the date for the installation of the new bishop next April earlier, but I also want to just let those of you who are less familiar with the workings of things know that the election of the next bishop will take place on October 19th. It will take place on October 19th, and among the people who will be electing the next bishop are a few people in this room, and if they don't mind, if they could stand, that way the rest of you can find them afterwards and tell them what you thought. Thank all of you for your service for the convocation. And thank you to our candidates for being here tonight, and for your participation. Thanks for being here. Good night.